Snow that night fell as though the heavens had emptied their weariness upon the earth. It drifted across the prairie in silver sheets, swallowing fences, muting hills, and burying all sound beneath a heavy hush. The wind prowled like a restless spirit, rattling doors and slipping beneath boards, carrying with it a cold that seemed intent on reminding every living thing of its fragility. Silas Boone lifted his collar against the sting and trudged toward the barn, lantern in hand. The flame within wavered, throwing a frail ring of light against the darkness, and each step groaned in the snow like a confession. At 30, Silas carried himself as one far older, not from years but from solitude. His days were measured by the scrape of hay, the squeak of tack, the muted thud of boots on packed earth. In town, men nodded politely but never lingered, women looked through him as though he were made of glass. He was remembered mostly for what he was not, a husband, a father, a man of company. In silence he endured, finding small solace in the low whicker of his horses or the flicker of his lantern's flame. He had come to believe there were no surprises left in life, no sudden turnings. And then, one winter night, his silence broke. It was the horses that warned him first, shifting nervously in their stalls as the wind clawed harder at the door. Silas lifted the lantern higher. Its glow stretched across the beams, over the shadows, and came to rest upon a shape half buried in hay. He froze, his breath lodging in his throat. A figure, slight, curled, unmoving save for the faint stir of breath. He stepped closer, the lantern trembling in his grip. For one strange instant, he thought it might be a ghost conjured by loneliness. But the light found a face. A woman lay there, her skin touched with frost, braids tangled, boots scuffed and worn thin. Her lips were tinged blue, yet there was a ferocity even in her stillness, as though she had chosen this place not by chance but by stubborn will. He should have shouted, demanded to know what she was doing in his barn. Instead, he crouched, lantern low, his heart pounding as though it might shatter the quiet. And in that pause, her eyes opened. Dark, sharp, startled. In an instant a knife gleamed in her hand, its edge quivering in the lamplight. The barn, vast a moment before, seemed too small to hold them both. Silas raised his hand slowly, palm outward. "I ain't here to harm you," he said, the words rasping from a throat unused to speech. The woman did not blink. Hunger hollowed her cheeks, exhaustion dragged her shoulders down, yet her gaze was as steady as the knife. Silence yawned between them, filled only by the restless horses. Then, with a suddenness that felt reckless even to himself, Silas reached into his coat. He drew out a crust of bread, saved from supper, and placed it gently on the hay between them. His hand trembled, not only from fear, but from the weight of what offering meant in that moment. Her eyes flickered to the bread. Suspicion lingered, but the fight in her muscles eased. Slowly, she lowered the knife, though she kept it close. She lifted the bread and ate, not greedily but with controlled hunger, as though to accept charity fully would wound her pride. Silas watched her, curiosity gnawing at caution. Who was she? Why had she chosen his barn? What storms had driven her to such a place? Yet he held the questions, sensing they were too heavy for the fragile quiet between them. The night stretched long. Outside, snow climbed higher against the door. Inside, the lantern burned low. Silas set a blanket within reach without looking at her directly. She pulled it close, wrapping herself with the careful grace of one unaccustomed to comfort. Later, when the lantern leaned, she adjusted it upright, a gesture so small it pierced him more deeply than words. Two exiles, breathing in the same hush. He lay awake long after she had drifted into uneasy sleep, listening to the storm, listening for ghosts, listening to the new rhythm her presence had given the air. Morning light was pale and grey, filtering weakly through cracks. Snow piled nearly to the sill, sealing them in. Silas's first thought was not of chores or cold but of the town. If they learned of her presence, tongues would lash like whips. He remembered Mrs. Whitcomb's sharp words years ago, "That Boone boy, no woman would have him. He'll end his days alone with his horses." He imagined her face if she knew an Apache woman slept under his roof. The scorn would cut deep, deeper still for the stranger who had already endured so much. For one moment, fear pressed on him, whispering to send her away. But when he turned, she was trying to scatter feed for the horses, her hands clumsy but intent. His chest tightened. Compassion overcame fear. He could not push her back into the storm. Later, when warmth from the fire softened her shoulders, she spoke at last. "Ahioka," she said, voice quiet but clear. Her name. Silas repeated it silently, as though afraid sound might break it. Ahioka, like a prayer half remembered. They spoke little else. Yet in their silence something grew. She mended a broken strap with nimble fingers, he carried water where she could reach it. Once, as they worked side by side, their hands brushed over leather, and for a breathless instant the world narrowed to that touch. It was not affection yet, it was recognition. Two souls marked by exile, finding themselves no longer invisible. But the world beyond their barn stirred restlessly. On the third day, hoofbeats thudded against the snow. The door creaked wide and Marshal Clay Dobbs stepped in, his hat rimed with frost. His gaze swept the barn, sharp and cold. "You seen a runaway Apache woman, Boone?" His tone was flat, but suspicion coiled beneath. Silas's pulse hammered, yet his voice remained steady. "Ain't seen nobody but my horses, Marshal. Storms kept me busy enough." Behind him, he felt a Hyoka's stillness, hidden in shadow. Dobbs studied him too long, eyes narrowing. At last he tipped his hat. "Be careful who you shelter," he warned, and turned away. Only when the hoofbeats faded did Silas exhale. Silence returned, heavy as iron, binding them tighter together. That night, by the fire's dim glow, Silas spoke words he had never dreamed of speaking. "They won't forgive," he said, voice low. "The town. The marshal. Judgment don't sleep long." He hesitated, then forced the thought out. "There's one way. Strange, maybe sudden. But a way." Ahioka's eyes, dark and unreadable, lifted to his. "What way?" she asked softly. Silas swallowed. "Marriage. My name could guard you some. Not perfect, but better than alone." The silence that followed was immense. Snow fell outside, whispering against the windows. She studied him, her lashes catching the faint glow. For a heartbeat he thought she would laugh, or turn away. But slowly, she nodded. It was not surrender. It was a choice, carved from necessity and a fragile thread of trust. The chapel stood bare against the winter sky, its wooden beams creaking beneath the weight of snow. Inside, there were no guests, no celebration. Only the wind pressing against the walls and the echo of their own breaths. The preacher spoke briefly, words plain and unadorned. Silas reached for her hand, rough palm against hers, and something shifted inside him. Not a blaze but a steady flame, as if the long years of loneliness had cracked open enough to let warmth through. When she spoke her vow, voice clear and unwavering, it was as though the storm itself hushed to listen. They walked out into falling snow as husband and wife, no witnesses but the sky itself. And though gossip would spread like wildfire, though eyes in town would linger with judgment, they carried something between them stronger than scorn. The weeks that followed tested them. Mrs. Whitcomb whispered in the mercantile, men paused their talk when Silas entered, and the marshal's gaze lingered longer than law required. Yet in their small house, resilience grew. Ahioka rose early to tend the horses, her presence steady as breath. Silas found himself laughing, a low, rusty sound, when she teased him about his clumsy stitching or his habit of overfeeding the animals. In the quiet evenings, they shared more silence than words, yet that silence no longer felt like exile. One night a storm tore through the prairie fiercer than any before. Wind howled, boards shook, and the barn shuddered as snow forced its way through cracks. Horses screamed and kicked against their stalls. Together they rushed into the chaos, lanterns swinging wildly. They hauled beams upright, soothed the panicked animals, their bodies aching and hands blooded. Snow blinded them, and exhaustion clawed at their limbs, but neither yielded. At last, when the roof held and the horses calmed, they collapsed side by side on the frozen earth, gasping. Their laughter rose, raw and breathless, cutting through the storm like firelight. In that moment, Silas no longer felt cursed. He felt chosen. Dawn crept pale and gold across the horizon. Snow lay heavy but quiet, the world scrubbed clean. Silas sat beside Ahioka, their shoulders pressed together, their silence rich now with something more than survival. He looked at her, words forming with difficulty. "I used to think silence was all I'd ever have." She met his gaze, steady and unafraid, and in her eyes he saw not emptiness but reflection, his own weary soul, now steadied by dignity. And if someday a wanderer should pause at their story, let them take this lesson. Loneliness does not end with grand declarations or perfect words. It ends with small mercies, an offered crust of bread, a blanket laid without ceremony, a hand extended in the dark. Even in the fiercest winter, the heart remembers the warmth of being seen. So, friend, never doubt what grace might wander into your barn one snowbound night, nor how it might change the silence within you forever.